Chad was a student pilot and he took his wife Brandy on an illegal flight to Las Vegas. Unfortunately, this vacation turned into their worst nightmare when they crashed. But that's not even the most shocking part of the story. That's why I'm going to share with you everything that went wrong, including why Chad was flying the plane to begin with. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. Chad and Brandy are from Wichita Falls, Texas, and on the 13th of September 2022, Chad decided he and Brandy would fly out to Las Vegas together. They were both only 42 years old when they crashed, and Chad was the one flying the plane. Chad started his aviation journey in December of 2020, almost 2 years prior to the accident, and at some point he purchased a Cessna 182 that he used for several of his training flights. This is a small single-engine aircraft that's commonly used for flight training. Now, it's important to understand that when you start taking flying lessons, you need to get a student pilot certificate, but you also need an FAA third-class medical exam to get your medical certificate before you're allowed to do your first solo flight. Even though you can start taking flying lessons prior to getting those certificates, a lot of student pilots will go ahead and get them before they start flight training because they want to make sure there's not going to be any issues or anything that's going to slow down their training. According to the investigation, Chad obtained his student pilot certificate on December 15, 2020, just a few days after he first started flying. However, when he tried to get his medical certificate, he ran into some issues because he reported that he had a history of alcohol and drug use and that he was also taking medication for anger and irritability. This meant the FAA wanted to take a closer look at his history to determine if they could actually grant him a medical certificate. That being said, this kind of put Chad in a difficult situation because he had already purchased an airplane and started his flight training, and now everything was on hold. Technically, Chad could keep taking the flying lessons, he just couldn't fly solo until his medical situation got resolved. That's probably why he only logged 8 flights between February and October of that year. My guess is that he was doing just enough to try and maintain some level of proficiency while he was waiting for the FAA to make their final decision. When it comes to his training, Chad's flight instructor said that he seemed to fly well, but he was anti-authority and impulsive with tendencies of pushing the aircraft he was flying to fly fast with higher than normal power settings. Over the course of almost a year, that instructor provided Chad with about 20 hours of flight instruction, and his last flight with Chad was in November of 2021 in the accident aircraft, which was about 10 months prior to the crash. Unfortunately, at some point during his training, the FAA got back to Chad and told him that his application for a medical certificate was denied, and that meant he could no longer pursue his goal of becoming a pilot. Now, when his instructor found out about this, he stopped flying with Chad. However, this wouldn't be the end of Chad's flying career. Chad continued to plead his case with the FAA, and while that was going on, he conducted a few flights with a commercial pilot who wasn't a flight instructor, and he logged those in December of 2021. However, Chad didn't log any flights after January of 2022 for the next 8 months leading up to the crash in September of that year. Now, just because he didn't log any flights, that doesn't necessarily mean that Chad wasn't flying. According to the investigation, there were local rumors that Chad would fly his Cessna 182 by himself on occasion, and if that's true, it reflects a very strong anti-authority attitude, and it's very dangerous. If you're not cleared to fly solo, then not only are you putting your own life at risk, but you're also jeopardizing the lives of other pilots flying in the same airspace as you, as well as anyone that's on the ground that you could end up crashing into because you don't have the proper training to fly the aircraft. I know that the FAA medical approval process can be frustrating at times, but that doesn't give you permission to blatantly violate the rules. And if Chad did in fact accomplish any solo flights, they all would have been illegal. If that's not bad enough, now we need to talk about the aircraft that Chad was flying. Because remember, he did most of his training in the Cessna 182 that he owned. But in November of 2021, he started flying a 1984 Piper PA-46-310 Malibu Mirage. If you're not familiar with this type of aircraft, it's a 6-seat, high-performance, complex aircraft with a pressurized cabin and retractable landing gear. Even though it's still a single-engine aircraft, this is a big change from the Cessna 182, and it's not a good choice to fly for a low-time pilot like Chad. You need a decent amount of experience, but more importantly, the proper training and endorsements to fly an aircraft like this. Despite the fact that Chad's instructor was no longer working with him and that Chad couldn't obtain a medical clearance, he still decided it would be a good idea to buy another aircraft, and he ended up purchasing the Malibu Mirage in January of 2022. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, most of you know that I do my best to avoid speculating during a debrief, and I always try to make it clear when I'm sharing my opinion versus the facts. In this case, the ADS-B data showed that the aircraft flew several times between the time Chad purchased it in January and when it crashed in September. And based on the evidence available, I think it's reasonable to assume that Chad was on board at least some, if not all, of those flights. I think it's also possible that he was flying the aircraft solo for some of those flights. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure how much time Chad spent in the accident aircraft, aside from a couple of the flights that he listed in his logbook. Either way, he must have felt confident in his ability because in September of that year, just 8 months after purchasing the aircraft, he and his wife hopped in the plane to fly out to Las Vegas. Chad's plan was to fly with Brandy from Wichita Falls out to the Double Eagle Airport in New Mexico for a brief stop before continuing the flight to Las Vegas for what was probably supposed to be a fun vacation getaway. Keep in mind that Chad still had a student pilot certificate, and that specifically prohibited him from carrying passengers. I know that might seem like a moot point because he didn't have a medical certificate and he hadn't been checked out in the aircraft either, but I think this is a really good lesson for anyone that's not a pilot. If you get invited to go fly with a friend or a family member, you need to ask the pilot to show you their certificate, and don't be afraid to ask them questions about their qualifications. This doesn't mean that Brandy is at fault for any of this. Rather, I'm just trying to help prevent another tragedy like this from happening. That being said, the first flight from Texas to New Mexico was relatively uneventful as far as we know, and after Chad landed, he was only on the ground for about an hour before taking off on the second leg to Las Vegas. According to the investigation, there was no evidence that Chad obtained a pre-flight weather briefing in Texas or New Mexico, or that he got any weather updates during the flight. Even though the weather in Texas and Las Vegas might have called for clear skies, the problem was there were some thunderstorms in between. I can't tell you how many mishaps have taken place simply because the pilot failed to get a weather briefing prior to the flight. It only takes a few minutes, and if Chad had gotten a briefing, it would have included information regarding a convective SIGMET that was issued by the National Weather Service. This is a weather advisory that warns pilots about severe weather conditions that could be hazardous to your flight. In this case, the SIGMET warned that there was an area of severe thunderstorms along his route of flight with cloud tops to flight level 390, including hail up to 1 inch in diameter and wind gust up to 50 knots. Regardless of the thunderstorms, Chad took off from New Mexico on a VFR flight plan, and he requested VFR flight following for the trip. One of the main benefits of VFR flight following is that the air traffic controllers are going to provide you with weather advisories, and this would turn out to be a big debrief point that I'm going to talk about later when we look at what the controller did. However, for right now, we know that after Chad got airborne, he told the controller he was climbing to 16,500 feet to avoid the weather, and about 15 minutes later, he said he was climbing to 17,500 feet and deviating to the south for clouds. The reason this is important is because this is pretty much as high as he can go while remaining VFR. The airspace above 18,000 feet or flight level 180 is Class A airspace, which is for IFR traffic, so Chad couldn't climb into that airspace unless he declared an emergency. And I just want to point out that this is a scenario we see a lot of times when VFR pilots are trying to get around the weather. They see the clouds building up out in front of them, and typically there's also a solid layer that's preventing them from descending and flying below the clouds. So instead they start climbing thinking they're going to get above the weather. The only problem is that the clouds can build up faster than you can climb, and the next thing you know, you find yourself out of options. If you're a VFR-only pilot, just stay away from the clouds, especially if you see a giant wall of cumulus clouds building up in front of you. Don't try to climb over them. Sometimes the best decision is to just turn around and divert somewhere else until the weather clears. This was the radar picture when Chad said he was deviating to the south for the clouds, and the controller told him that if he were to turn back towards his destination, the weather would be better and easier to pick through. Keep in mind that controllers can't see the clouds, but they have access to weather radar, and they also get real-time reports from other pilots flying in the area. And continuing straight ahead or possibly deviating to the north would have been a better option to avoid some of the larger buildups that were seen on the radar. Unfortunately, Chad had very little to no experience in this kind of situation, and instead he was just looking at the clouds directly in front of him, and he had no idea he only had about 20 minutes left to live. I'm about to share with you what happened during the final moments of the flight, including some of the radio calls that Chad made, as well as what the controller said, and then I'll explain why Chad crashed, but be sure to stick around to the end for the most shocking part of this story. At some point during the turn to the south, Chad switched radio frequencies to talk to Los Angeles Center. However, he never told the controller he was changing frequencies, so listen to what happened when he checked in.
LA Center, Malibu 43605 at 17,700.
Aircraft calling again?
Malibu 43605.
November 43605, LA Center, the Darren Canyon altimeter 3019er.
3019er, 605.
Basically, there's some initial confusion when he checks in because the controller didn't know who he was since there wasn't a proper handoff from Albuquerque Center. For the next 10 minutes, there are numerous radio calls from other aircraft that are trying to coordinate deviating around the weather. The reason this is important is because Chad is on a VFR clearance and IFR traffic take priority, so the controller is focused on those other aircraft, and she's expecting Chad to stay VFR and remain clear of the weather. Instead, Chad kept flying directly towards the storm in front of him, and pretty soon everything started to fall apart.
November 605, area of moderate to heavy precipitation at your 12 o'clock. Advise.
The controller finally recognized that Chad was heading for the storms, and she tried to warn him, but that was a very non-standard radio call. And you could tell that she didn't have a lot of experience making a radio call like that, and the reason why is because she was a controller in training. Now, I know that might not seem like a big deal, but words mean things, and the correct phraseology would sound something like November 43605, area of moderate to heavy precipitation at your 12 o'clock, 5 miles, moving east at 15 knots, cloud tops 390. Also, instead of just saying the word advise and kind of trailing off, she should have said something like state intentions or deviations north of course approved, state intentions. Either way, listen to Chad's response.
Malibu 605. So far, I've been able to dodge these little buildups, but it is getting thicker.
Did you hear what he said? So far, I've been able to dodge these little buildups, but they're getting thicker. That's a clear sign of a pilot that doesn't have a plan, and I think that the controller should have asked him again to clarify his intentions and advise if he needed any assistance. This also would have been a great opportunity for the controller's instructor to hop on the radio to clarify everything, but that never happened. Unfortunately, when the controller heard Chad say that he was going to dodge the weather, she kind of stopped paying attention to what he was doing and instead focused on all the other traffic. The NTSB never said anything about the air traffic controller being a possible contributing factor to this tragedy. However, what's interesting is that there was a separate report in the investigation docket that debriefed the air traffic controllers, and it said that the weather that was issued to November 43605 was not timely, the deviation phraseology was incorrect, call signs were regularly dropped in subsequent transmissions to multiple aircraft, and the controller allowed herself to get conversational, and additionally, the controller's instructor did not intervene in a timely manner. Don't get me wrong, even if the controller had done a better job of warning Chad about the weather, I don't think it would have made a difference in what happened next because Chad had already demonstrated a pattern of behavior of doing whatever he wanted regardless of the rules. Less than 1 minute after the controller gave Chad that weather advisory, he entered the storm. This graphic shows how powerful the part of the storm was that he flew into, and it included multiple lightning strikes, and the energy from the storm was producing a maximum vertical wind velocity of about 39 meters per second, which is about 7,600 feet per minute. Chad never made any radio calls for help, and his aircraft was observed changing course, descending at a rapid rate while making several 360-degree turns that went unnoticed by the controller until about 4 minutes later.
November 43605, LA Center. See you changed course. Do you need any directions? November 605, LA Center. How do you hear?
November 43605, November 43605, LA Center radio check.
Unfortunately, the ADS-B data from the flight simply doesn't do it justice to give you an idea of what the weather was like and how terrifying this was. This is video footage from a security camera on the ground near the crash site location, and you can see how overcast, rainy, and windy it was. The camera captured the final moments of the flight as the aircraft came crashing down. Before I share the worst part of this entire story, let me just say that sometimes I struggle with making a video like this because I know that friends and family members of the victims could end up watching this. In fact, Chad and Brandy left 4 children behind whose lives will never be the same, and my heart goes out to them, and I hope that they never watch this video because this video isn't for them. This video is for people that want to be pilots, so you hopefully understand the kind of responsibility that comes with being a pilot. The worst part of this entire story, though, is that when they conducted the autopsy of the victims, they discovered fluoxetine and trazodone in Chad's system. Fluoxetine can be taken for anger and irritability. Trazodone can be taken to treat depression or insomnia, and the NTSB said that these conditions may be associated with impulsive behavior and increased risk-taking and not appreciating consequences of actions. Regardless of the medication, at the time of the crash, Chad only had about 47 hours of total flight experience that he had logged and only about 4 hours of simulated instrument time. That means even on his best day, it would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to maintain aircraft control once he flew into the storm. As soon as he entered the weather, he got spatially disoriented and lost control of the aircraft, which resulted in exceeding the design limits of the airframe, and the aircraft broke apart in flight. However, I think the one sentence in the final report that summed up the root cause of this tragedy was when the NTSB said there was evidence that Chad had a pattern of poor decision-making, high risk tolerance, and impulsive behavior. Those are not the characteristics you want to have if you're planning on becoming a pilot, and unfortunately, because of Chad's decisions, 2 lives were lost. I hope this debrief, as tragic as it was, helps to prevent future mishaps. If you learned something from it, then be sure to check out one of these other videos on the screen, and thanks for your support.